Turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 11, and we will read verses 25 through 28. This is part 4 of the prophecy of the kings of the south and north, and we will look at the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes in our lesson tonight. Verse 25 says, "He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacy shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table. But it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land." Antiochus Epiphanes, the son of Antiochus the Great, is now the king of the Seleucids. He came to the throne by the means of craft and murder. He is a man of low morals, and he has no scruples, and he does whatever he feels necessary to get what he wants. He has no loyalty other than to himself. Well, this has been true of a lot of kings in history, and it's true of a lot of people that are involved in politics in our day and age. While he thought himself as Epiphanes, which means the illustrious one, behind his back people called him Epiphanes, meaning the madman. That's what people's real opinion of Antiochus was. In verses 20 through 24, which we read last week, we saw that he was able to take control of Egypt for a while. But even with that victory under his belt, he realized he would yet be involved in another war with the Ptolemies. Epiphanes starts the war, or restarts the war, in 170 BC by advancing on Egypt with a great army. Ptolemy Philometor was renounced as king of Egypt, and Ptolemy Euergetes, or Ptolemy Physcon, his younger brother, was accepted as king in his place. Now, the low character and deceit of Epiphanes were again used to his advantage. The prophecy says concerning the king of the south, "Those who eat of the portion of his delicacy shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain." Adam Clark explains this for us. He says, "The intrigues of Antiochus, corrupting the ministers and officers of Ptolemy, were the cause of all the disasters that fell on the Egyptian king. They that fed of the portion of his meat, who were in his confidence and pay, and possessed the secrets of the state, betrayed him. And these were the means of destroying him and his army, so that he was defeated, as was before observed." So it did not go well for Ptolemy, because his own people turned against him, as the prophecy said they would do. In verse 27, we see that two kings are mentioned, and those two kings are Antiochus and Philometor. Ptolemy Philometor was actually the nephew of Antiochus Epiphanes through Cleopatra. Epiphanes used this relationship to turn Philometor against his brother Euergetes. Verse 27 says, "Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil." Nothing new there. "And they shall speak lies at the same table. But it shall not prosper, for the end will still be at the appointed time." So the question is, who can be trusted here? And obviously it is neither Philometor or Epiphanes can be trusted, and they should know this. Adam Clark explains for us. He says, that is, Antiochus and Ptolemy Philometor, who was the nephew of the former, and whose interest he now pretended to have much at heart, since the Alexandrians had renounced their allegiance to him and set his younger brother Euergetes upon the throne. When Antiochus came to Memphis, he and Philometor had frequent conferences at the same table, and at these times they spoke lies to each other. Antiochus professing great friendship to his nephew and concern for his interests, yet in his heart designing to ruin the kingdom by fomenting the discords which already subsisted between the two brothers. On the other hand, Philometor professed much gratitude to his uncle for the interest he took in his affairs, and laid the blame of the war upon his minister Euolius, who at the same time he spoke lies, determining as soon as possible to accommodate matters with his own brother, and join all their strength against their deceitful uncle. So here Epiphanes tried to get Philometor, his nephew, to side with him, being deceitful. And so they had these lunch meetings. And Epiphanes would lie to Philometor, and Philometor would lie to Epiphanes, because on the side, Philometor was trying to reconcile with his brother and unite their efforts against Antiochus Epiphanes. So the result of this alliance between the nephew and the uncle does not prosper, as neither of them succeeded in accomplishing what he wanted, for the prophetic reason, for the end will still be at the appointed time. That's what the prophecy says. This means war would break out again, because God had not yet ordained that it should come to an end. When God steps into the affairs of humans, things do not get finished until God says they are finished, and they do not last any longer than God allows them to last. So while Antiochus was trying to end the war, really by taking over Egypt, God said, not time yet. It's just not time yet. In 169 BC, Epiphanes returned from Egypt, marching through Judea. It had been reported that Epiphanes had been killed in battle, and there was therefore much rejoicing in Jerusalem over this news. The Jews in Judea did not like Antiochus Epiphanes, and when they heard that he'd been killed, they celebrated. This enraged Antiochus, and he turned against the Jews, putting down an insurrection that was led by the high priest Jason. He also took this opportunity to plunder the temple, called in the prophecy the Holy Covenant. This act is also recorded in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 20 through 40, and in 2 Maccabees chapter 5. So you can read in your copy of the Apocrypha of what happened there. Going on to verses 29 and 30. The prophecy says, at the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the Holy Covenant and do damage. Now the paragraph actually stops here, and the rest of verse 30 begins a new paragraph. So if you're following along, you notice I don't say any more from verse 30. 2 years after later, after this event with them having these lunch meetings and stuff like that, Antiochus launches a new attack against Egypt. Now, the New King James Version speaks of the ships from Cyprus, whereas if you are reading from the original King James or the King James Version, it calls the place Chittim. The Hebrew word for this place is Kiti. Strong's Concordance gives as the definition of this word, Patriol from an unused name denoting Cyprus, only in the plural. A Kittite or a Cypriot, hence an islander in general, that is, the Greeks or Romans on the shores opposite Palestine. So the ships from Cyprus are actually the Roman Navy. They are stationed just off the coast of Palestine on that island there that's called Cyprus. Matthew Henry briefly relates the events in verses 20 through 30. He writes, Antiochus did not succeed this time as he had done the two previous times. Ships from Cyprus, the Roman navy, or an envoy from Rome, came to the aid of Egypt. Ptolemaeus Philometor now was in an alliance with Rome. Antiochus had laid siege to the city of Alexandria, and the Roman Senate ordered him to stop the siege. He asked for time to consider the matter, but Popilius, one of the ambassadors, drew a circle around him in the sand and told him that he must give him a positive answer before he could leave the circle. Fearing reprisal from the Romans, he complied and ordered his army to retreat out of Egypt. Boy, what if we settled international differences this way? All right, fella, stand here. Here's a circle. Now, before you get out of the circle, you've got to tell me yes. You've got to do what I want you to do. We certainly don't see that very much. It seems like America's enemies are drawing the circle, and we're just kind of stuck there. Verses 30 through 35. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices, and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong, and carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many. Yet for many days they shall fall by sword and flame, by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. And some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. Lots contained in those few verses. And these verses appear to be the very focal point of the entire prophecy. This is what the prophecy has been leading up to. The Jews in Judea had had a long line of misery from the later Ptolemies and the Seleucids. What could be worse? The prophecy gives the answer to that question, and that answer is Antiochus Epiphanes. We will read along with Adam Clark as we investigate these verses. In verse 30, he returns in rage against the Holy Covenant and does damage. Okay? Clark writes, for he vented his rage against the Jews, and he sent his general these names sometimes hard to say. His general Apollonius with 22,000 men against Jerusalem, plundered and set fire to the city, pulled down the houses round about it, slew much of the people, and built a castle on an eminence that commanded the temple, and slew multitudes of the poor people who had come up to worship, polluted every place, so that the temple service was totally abandoned, and all the people fled from the city. And when he returned to Antioch, he published a decree that all should conform to the Grecian worship, and the Jewish worship was totally abrogated, and the temple itself consecrated to Jupiter Olympius. How great must the wickedness of the people have been when God could tolerate this? He shows regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. That's what the prophecy says. Clark says, in the transacting of these matters, he had intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. With wicked Menelaus, remember he was made the high priest because he gave Epiphanes more money than did Jason. And the apostate Jews united with him, who gave from time to time such information to Antiochus as excited him against Jerusalem, the temple, and the people. It was really sad when the Jews turned against their own people, against the temple, and against the true worship of God to side with this man, Antiochus Epiphanes. With regard to verse 31, it speaks of the defiling of the sanctuary. The classic commentary provides us with some pictures of what took place. With his armies camped nearby, Antiochus sent Apollonius with 22,000 soldiers to destroy Jerusalem just 2 years after he had captured it himself. While pillaging and destroying the city, Apollonius killed most of the inhabitants. The defenders built a fortress near the temple, but they were soon attacked and killed. The sanctuary was the last place of strength. God's people protected the area as the spiritual stronghold against the invaders. Apollonius polluted it with altars to idols and heathen sacrifices of swine. Antiochus dictated the temple to Jupiter Olympius and decreed that at the pain of death, all must conform to his brand of Greek religion. He then identified himself with his God, hoping to make his worship universal. No other world ruler had interfered with the religious worship of God's covenant people. And that is a very true saying. The Babylonians did not require the Jews to stop worshiping their God. The Persians did not stop them from worshiping God. The Ptolemies did not stop them from worshiping God. The earlier Seleucids did not stop them from worshiping their God. But Antiochus Epiphanes made it illegal for the Jews to worship their God. He made the Jewish religion illegal. He made it illegal. It was not just the army of Antiochus that defiled the temple. But if you remember what that commentary said, the apostate Jews were also involved in its desecration. That's how far some of them had fallen away from God. And God have mercy on a nation when its people fall away from God. And God have mercy on a Christian nation when it abandons the Christian faith, when it turns and persecutes the Christians. We should take a lesson from history. It was at this time that Epiphanes took away the daily sacrifices, which we know are the evening and morning sacrifices prescribed by the law of Moses. The abomination of desolation was this statue of Zeus that Epiphanes had set in the temple. It is interesting to note that Jesus referred to the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place as an indication of the impending destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It is shameful to the human race that we can deny so heinously the God of creation and think that we can get away with it. We cannot, and we will not get away with it. Remember the flood of Noah's day. Remember the obliteration of Israel, the northern kingdom. Remember the Babylonian captivity of Judah, the southern kingdom. Remember the disaster here described under Epiphanes. And remember the destruction of Jerusalem under Titus in 70 AD. And finally, think about that great day of the Lord, soon to come at the end of time. Man may shake his fist in the face of God, and God may delay judgment. But the Bible and history tells us that judgment comes. Civilization after civilization after civilization have fallen to the judgments of God. And today, humans think we're so smart. We have all the answers. We don't need God. We dismiss God. But God will have the last word. That's called the final judgment. Verse 32 contrasts the behavior of the corrupt Jews with the Jews who know God. These last ones, the Jews who know God, the Bible says, will be strong and carry out great exploits. Well, what does this mean? Well, the record of history tells us that many of these dear saints of God chose to endure and suffer persecution and torture rather than give up their faith in God. And this has happened down through the Christian era. It happens in the present day in some countries in this world, and it could happen here in the United States of America. One example was a man by the name of Eleazar, who was a principal scribe, who had pig flesh stuffed in his mouth. He spit it out, knowing that it would cost him his life. This is recorded in 2 Maccabees chapter 6:19. The Jews do not eat swine flesh. It was an abomination to them. And whereas they tied this man down and stuffed the pig's flesh into his mouth, he did not hesitate to spit it out, knowing it meant his death. Another was a mother who saw her 7 sons put to death for staying true to their religion, recorded in 2 Maccabees chapter 7. An unnamed host is honored in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 35, with this epitaph: women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. These are the saints of God who suffered horribly under the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 33 tells that some stood and encouraged the others by their example of faith. In response, Antiochus had these people tortured and put to death, showing them no mercy whatsoever. An example of this was that women were put to death because they had their male babies circumcised. The bodies of their dead babies hung around their necks while they themselves were being killed. That's horrible. Recorded in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 60 and 61. These atrocities, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, my friend. These atrocities committed by Antiochus Epiphanes incited what is called the Maccabean Revolt. Judas Maccabees and his followers stood up for their religion, and they fought back. There comes a time when we must fight back, even in the name of a faith that is dear to us. Take a stand. It's one thing to suffer and suffer and suffer. But when God says it's enough, it's enough. And God calls men like Judas Maccabees here to stand up and fight back. Verse 34 says, when they fall. Who are these that fall? Well, these are the Seleucids. You see, the Maccabees were initially successful in stopping this reign of terror imposed on the Jews by the Seleucids. However, the Seleucids were aided with a little help. That is, troops came and put down the revolt. But ultimately, the Romans, along with the Herodians, gained control over Judea. Verse 35 is more or less a summary overview of the events of this revolt, the Maccabean revolt. It doesn't go into a great detail, but it suggests that there were a series of successes and setbacks that eventually led to the Seleucids retaining control over Judea at the time. Okay? The verse speaks of a time of the end, and that it was still for the appointed time. This statement is a tribute, again, to the sovereignty of God. You see, God allowed Antiochus Epiphanes to rule and to do the horrible things he did. One could say, well, why would God do that? You have to ask God that question. But friends, God was in control the whole time. God knew Antiochus Epiphanes would come. He knew what he would do. But he set a line in history past which Epiphanes could not go. God said, you can only do this for so long. God appointed a time of the end past which Antiochus could not go. And that end came with the coming of the Romans and the Herodians. And you remember who the Herodians are, going back to King Herod, the little horn that we studied in chapter 7.